So I was coming up here to start with what a small world it is that led to my involvement with MatchPoint, and then I see my high school point guard, Steve Sterling, sitting right here. Best point guard I ever played with, by the way. And so we...
Right on cue.
No doubt. But small world because whenever I was in high school, my dream was to go play for LSU. And like most high school athletes, I thought I was a little better than I was. And so I assumed LSU would just, come sleep at my doorstep until I signed with them, and they didn't do that. And so I ended up having to go a different direction. Well, one of the reasons why I signed with Samford University was because the head coach there promised me we would play LSU before I graduated. And so, sure enough, my senior year, we come back here to Baton Rouge, we beat LSU, and the next year, that head coach gets the head coaching job at LSU, named John Brady. So my point is, in telling you that, it is ironic in two different ways that I am now in the business of helping LSU athletes. Number one, you just heard, and number two, also former players of mine are now coming back to play for LSU. Jordan Wright, Carlos Stewart have transferred from their universities that will be Tigers next year, and you guys are really, really going to enjoy watching them play. So pretty excited to be here, but again, super, super small world. I'm going to kind of run through the timeline of NIL and how it started and then why it is where it is today. And then I'm going to leave enough time, hopefully, open for questions because I've done several of these already, and there are always a ton of questions at the end of this. So hopefully we have enough time for plenty. The Alston cases, and I'm not going to get into too much depth and detail about all the legality stuff, but the Alston case that you may have heard about that actually was the one that broke open name, image, and likeness was not the first issue. There was a former basketball player named Ed O'Bannon who played at UCLA years and years ago. I think he might have been the National Player of the Year. I know his team at UCLA won a national championship his last year. But his face was on the cover of EA Sports College Basketball, the video game. Well, he didn't get paid for that, and he didn't get asked if it could be used on the cover of the video game. So he takes it to court, and he loses. And so when people think, oh, the Alston case did this, no, that's actually what planted the seed, was Ed O'Bannon complaining, and rightfully so, that he didn't get paid for his likeness to be used on the cover of a video game. So fast forward, July 1, 2021, the floodgates open. And let's do this before we even get started. For those of you, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, for those of you who have a bad taste in your mouth about NIL, okay? And there are people, it's like any industry, right? I mean, you could say the same thing about lawyers, doctors, insurance, whatever, okay? For anybody who has a bad taste in your mouth, keep an open mind now for the primary reason, because it's not going anywhere. It's going to be here regardless, okay? The floodgates open with really three main rules put in place by the NCAA. One, you cannot pay an athlete for performance on the field, on the court, in the pool, on a track, any of those things. So in other words, you cannot simply say, hey, if you throw for 350 yards this Saturday, I'm going to pay you X for this, okay? You cannot use it for recruiting, right? Right. Well, it didn't work for him, but anyhow, so you can't use it for recruiting in this manner. I can't, if I were a college coach, walk into the house of a prospective athlete and say, if you come to our school, we are going to make sure you make this much in NIL. Right. Not saying it's not happening, but it's illegal. You also cannot do the same thing for retention, to retain an athlete in your program, which we know the transfer portal, which is my major issue with college sports. Not this year because my guys are coming back, but after this year it will be. It cannot be used. You cannot say, look, if you stay, we're going to pay you this much. We're going to make sure that you make this much, okay? And really and truly, guys, if you get caught cheating with this, you really got to try to get caught. Because if I'm a college coach and I walk into a home of a prospective athlete, all I have to say is, when asked about NIL, because they're all going to ask about NIL, okay? When I'm asked, I say, well, here's what was set up for our team last year. You know, you don't have to disclose dollar amounts and all those things. Here's how our program works. And then most campuses have some type of NIL director that can explain all of the logistics to it, so that at least you know that there's a legitimate NIL program on campus, or there's not. Because now, look, it is what it is. It is a factor in why kids choose the schools that they go to, period, okay? And I'll be honest, when I was first approached about joining MatchPoint, I was kind of on the fence, right? Because I'm kind of old school, and I was like, yeah, I got a scholarship, I had my meals paid for, I had everything taken care of, that was enough, right? But again, probably a little harder for me playing at Samford, not in front of, like, if you walk into Tiger Stadium and see 90,000 people and go, wow, I'm one of the reasons all these people are here. And then you take into account that your head coach is making $10, $12 million a year on top of that, then all of a sudden, it kind of made me feel a little bit differently about this. Now, is there a lot of good about NIL? Absolutely. Are there some bad things about NIL? Unquestionably. But again, that's no different than any industry in my opinion. So very quickly, when the NCAA allowed, because they didn't have a choice, name, image, and likeness to be used for kids to profit from, states started making their own laws. And when they started making their own laws, some of those laws conflicted with the NCAA rules. So imagine you're in a state that has laws that conflict with the NCAA that your university plays under, and you break an NCAA rule, but it's legal in your state. Technically, you could sue your own school in that situation. So what ended up happening pretty quickly after that, now granted, we have not heard of any instances like that, right? But what happened pretty quickly after that was states started to be a little bit less restrictive in their rules, which would allow schools, coaching staffs, people that are involved with the program to be directly involved with NIL as long as they were not involved with the payout process. So, Coach Kelly, for example, Coach Mulkey, who was up here last week, she can't say, hey, I got a deal set up for you for this much money, I'll have the money for you next week, right? That can't be done. But Coach Mulkey could introduce a business to a prospective student athlete, okay? All of those things are legal as of now. Now, what's funny about that, and ironic again, is who kind of started that process of repealing the laws and making sure that they were a little bit looser? Alabama / Nick Saban, right? And then Louisiana fell in line pretty quickly, and so did the rest of the SEC. Also, one thing that is a little, I guess, murky is that agents can be involved. So sports agents can now be involved with college athletes. And again, I thought at the very beginning, I was like, I don't think that's going to be a good thing. However, what we have come to find out is the agents that are involved with these student athletes, for the most part, now there are still those shady people who are, latchers on and they're not going to handle it the right way. But most of the agents who actually have a successful track record, they're really just doing it to develop the relationship with a kid if and when he eventually or she eventually turns professional, right? Because at the end of that student athlete's eligibility or when they declare for the draft, the agreement dissipates, it's gone. But then they could just re-sign with that same agent. So they already have the relationship in place. And most agents aren't getting off the couch for less than probably 25 grand in a deal anyhow. And even though you've heard all these crazy numbers, which, by the way, most of the numbers that you see, most of the market evaluations of student athletes that you see, it's not that they're not true, it's that they're not close to being true, okay? And so don't pay as much, it's probably like the way you guys deal with the media in other regards, right? Maybe politics, maybe government, maybe whatever. You're like, I don't know if I believe that, I don't know. Well, I can tell you, do not pay as much attention to these numbers as most people are, okay? Because again, they're just not true. So when I say $25,000, the percentage of kids who might make $25,000 in a year off of NIL is minuscule, much less on one deal, okay? Now, do the elite athletes make that at times? Yeah, absolutely, they do, no question about it. The deal, and I'm sure Coach Mulkey talked about Angel Reese and all the things that have gone, right? Her brand is blown up. But why has her brand blown up primarily? Because they won the national title, right? If they hadn't won the national title, she would just be another athlete that was out there acting, crazy and getting on Caitlin Clark and the whole thing. And they would just view her no big deal. No, they won a national title. So now it's serious. I'll never forget watching, some of you guys probably have seen the documentary of Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls, The Last Dance. Right? I'll never forget him saying this. He said, very quickly, I learned that all the dollars attached to my endorsement deals came from one source, and that was my performance on the court, what I did on the court. And these athletes that have bought into that understand that if they're performing, okay, that's one. Number two, and I know we said no pay for play, but businesses aren't going to work with somebody who's on the bench normally, right? Walk-ons will, sorry, yeah, you're right. Fair enough. We didn't even set that up either, that was great, yeah. But also you take into account the fact that you want that student athlete to align with your business's values, and you want their social media following to be strong as well, which leads me into the ROI aspect of this, because businesses ask us all the time, well, where do you get ROI from? I mean, I don't see how would you track it? How would you do this? How would you do that? Well, that's the first way. Number one, you find a student athlete that you feel is aligned with your values, and then on top of that, their social media following is large, significant enough. You can track those things. There are easy mechanisms that can be used to track those things. The other way, which leads me to probably the strongest on the fence word, collective, in the NIL space. The other way is, if you were to give to the collective, I don't think anybody in here would disagree, right or wrong, that when LSU is good, the economy is better, right? So at the same time we're saying no pay for play, it's not about you paying an individual, it's about money being available, okay, through local business owners, pooling it together, that can then be dispersed through legitimate NIL deals, that can be tracked through deliverables, that can be paid out and contracted, and all the things that have to be done, okay, taxes taken care of, like for example, our entity, MatchPoint, takes care of all those things strictly through our tech that she basically built out. And at the end of the day, all of it is completely above board, completely legal, and LSU attracts more student athletes, the really elite ones, to want to come to the school. And then, look, when we win, everybody wins. We know that. It's just part of the deal, okay? So those are the two primary sources of ROI, in my opinion. And the collective, again, okay, can be viewed positively and negatively. The way I just showed you is a very positive way, okay? The negative way, and it's happening across the country, is simply, we got all this money in this collective, let's make sure the quarterback gets this amount of money, let's make sure the point guard gets this amount of money, let's make sure the outside hitter on the volleyball team gets this amount of money, so on and so forth. I'm not saying those things aren't going on, I just know they're not going on here, because we are heavily, heavily involved with Bayou Traditions, the collective, at this point in time, and since we are involved in the transactional piece of all of it and the communication part of it, I know what's going on, okay? So that is a good thing, and I think you guys should feel comforted by that, the fact that LSU is above board with those things. And it's probably, honestly, why it took them a little bit longer to form a collective than other universities, because they wanted to see what was done wrong and then learn from it and then move into the space in the right way. Where is it headed? Some of you may have heard or read about the possibility of student athletes becoming employees of schools. And there is that possibility, and they're talking about football, men's basketball, women's basketball. Charlie Baker, who is the new president of the NCAA, and I think he's got the federal government's ear because he was the governor of Massachusetts, so he's got some background in that. He is begging for federal legislation. We believe federal legislation needs to come in and regulate it so that some of these numbers and this crazy stuff that's happening kind of level out a little bit. And then it gets back to exactly what NIL was originally supposed to be, which is a student athlete having to do something, a deliverable, right? Autograph session, going to do a charity, going to a hospital to visit a kid, a social media post, having to do something to get paid, okay? But I think federal legislation will come in and it will at least scare some of the ones who are doing it incorrectly into doing it correctly. But the irony is this. I know I'm all over irony today, right? The one rule, in my opinion, that is the most complained about rule, okay, and I don't agree with it, but Title IX has probably been one of the most complained about rules in the NCAA. It may be the reason amateur sports is saved. Because the minute you make college athletes employees, and they can unionize, and they can ask for this and demand that, and so on and so forth, they're pros. They're pros, right? But if you only allow certain sports to do it, and not the minor sports and not the female sports outside of women's basketball, that's a court case that could last for quite some time. And I think there's a chance Title IX might block that, and amateur sports, the amateur status of it may be saved at the end of the day. So with that, that's where we are today. Again, okay, right now the most recent thing is the employees of our student athletes becoming employees. We'll see where that heads. I do believe Charlie Baker has his mind wrapped around it, and we're going to see where it goes from there. I'm going to leave the rest of the time for questions, and I'm going to call, before I answer any, I'm going to call Mackenzie up as well, because she'll be able to answer some of these questions probably better than I can. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed that you keep saying the major sports, so football, basketball, women's basketball. Is gymnastics not included in that, particularly when I think about how well some of the women gymnasts at LSU have marketed themselves?
It's not nationwide, because nationwide it's not a revenue generating sport. At LSU, it is, okay? The revenue generating sports are the ones that we're talking about, and ultimately we know that those are the ones, football primarily, that kind of float the rest of the athletic program. And so, yes, you are correct about LSU. You would be correct about Utah. You would be correct about some other programs, but nationwide, that's not considered a revenue generating sport. Yes?
Of what you know, what are Olivia Dunn and Angel Reese and Bryce from quarter from Alabama? What were their NIL worth?
Those two are accurate.
Go ahead.
So what am I speaking into?
Right there.
Hi. So LSU definitely has some of the highest earners in NIL, and it's the females. So to your point, Livy Dunn, Angel Reese, they're both seven-figure earners, and that's
real.
That's real, yes. But that is all marketing. That's not collective dollars. Now there's some collective dollars, of course, but they have marketed themselves correctly, and they've earned it.
Bryce,
As a follow-up to that, like for example, for Angel Reese, you might have thought she would leave school and go turn pro, but you turn pro in the WNBA and you make $250 a year.
Exactly.
She's
not
making
even
$1
close to
million.
$250 a year.
Not even that.
Right.
Yeah.
60, right? Yeah.
Some of this NIL stuff may keep a kid in school longer than the one and done type stuff. Huh?
Correctly.
The ones that it will keep are the non-guaranteed, super high first round draft picks. It's not going to keep them because they're fixing to go make fantasy money, right? But it will keep some of the others, And you mentioned Bryce Young, for example, okay? And I know Saban's been kind of flippant about this since the beginning, but when you think about it, when's the first time you heard Saban mention NIL? I don't know if you guys paid attention to it or not. It's when he mentioned that his quarterback, who he didn't even say by name, okay, who had never taken a snap, right? He said his quarterback was probably going to make about $1 million this year, okay? I don't think he did, but that's when he mentioned NIL. Why do you think he said that? To let everybody know, hey, you come to Alabama, you're going to make $1 million,
Yeah.
right? 100%. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I hear this is reaching down to the high school level. What can you say about that?
So as a former high school coach for a long time, by the way, 11 years, I was a little bit longer than that, and if y'all did the math and you heard 440-something wins over 11 years, I don't think that's possible, but I like that. I'm going to stick with it. We're staying with that number. The high school level, yes, it is legal in just over half the states right now, okay? Louisiana was one of the first. I think they were the 8th state to make it legal. I don't think there's anything to it, personally, okay? I think you have really 3 scenarios where a high school kid could benefit from NIL, let's say in Louisiana. I think number 1, it's an Arch Manning who's a super elite talent who people are going to, come at with NIL because his name means a lot, obviously. Number two, I think you could have a team deal. I think you might have a local community that may support a team, right? But at the same time, I mean, okay, if you pay a football team, what you can pay them, like $50 each, right, at the end of the day? Or there could be, and forgive me for how I'm going to frame this, but it's the best way to do it, I think. It could be that third string backup right tackle on the JV team whose uncle owns a restaurant and says, hey, I'm going to throw you a bone. Let's do an NIL deal, right? Those are really the only three that we've seen thus far, and I just don't think it's super, super significant. So I think, ironically, at the high school level, that's where it's almost exclusively, if you're talking about high dollars, for the elite kids. Yes?
Is anybody looking at how, at whether this is having any impact on the team dynamic? So I'm thinking about like an offensive tackle who's getting $20,000 a year, and he's getting, you know, the tar beat out of him every game, protecting a quarterback who's making $1 million a year. I could see some resentment building up there.
We've seen a little bit of that. Honestly, offensive tackles get paid pretty well. It's the tight ends that, you know, we need to up our game. But no, we have actually built into our contract for that reason. They need to learn confidentiality. Keep your mouth shut. There's a reason for that. So we had a little bit of that early on, and I'm talking on a local level, not just nationally here. And that's why we updated our contract to combat that. But people are going to talk. Yeah.
Wow.
Similar to the pros, I guess.
No doubt. Yes?
Can you explain how the transfer portal relates to all of this, and does that have any impact that might trickle down to high school athletics?
Are you talking about recruiting, are you talking about transferring high school to high school?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's pretty, in my opinion, kind of draconian, the rules that these athletes are under, that they're, you know, and there should be more freedom at this, you know, high school level. And I wasn't quite clear on even at the college level, was that all tied in with the NIL stuff?
It wasn't. It's inevitably tied in though, right? Because if you are, not playing as much as you want to, and I'm very bitter about the transfer portal, by the way. Again, next year I will be. That I feel like it removes commitment from kids, right? And you got to actually work through something. But I think that the other part is, you know, schools when you enter the transfer portal, you're open season for recruiting just like you were in high school, right? So they'll reach out and they're going to have that discussion about NIL. And if it's done illegally, where they say, here's how much you will make, and they'll make more than they will at the school they're at, then yes, absolutely it's tied in. As far as the high school angle is concerned, we haven't seen it yet. I have heard high schools talk about it, right? Do we develop an NIL program that draws middle school kids to want to come to us? And trust me, I understand the draconian rules you're talking about transfers, and even kids coming out of middle school, right? They may have to sit depending on where they go. We haven't seen it materialize yet, but we've heard it discussed for sure. Yes?
Would you like to comment on the unionization of the players?
Well, we haven't seen it happen yet because they're not employees, but I'm sorry, I was supposed to do all of that at the beginning. I apologize. Yeah, I knew I'd forget that. He asked, can we comment on the unionization of the players, right? And so we haven't seen it happen yet because they're not employees yet. But if and when that happens, and they are able to become employees, and they can form their own union, then they can ask for extended health care, which they've already asked for, which they can ask for revenue sharing, which is the big one, right? Because these TV contracts are huge. Now, everybody looks at it and goes, well, that's really messed up. Why would the athletes ask for that? And I get that, partially. But I also get that they're the ones on TV playing, right? So the minute that they become employees, they have every right to ask for that because they're the ones generating the revenue with that. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with all of it. I'm just saying it is something that's out there, okay? Who else? Yes?
Little history, I played for LSU through '72, and what we got in those days was $15 a month for laundry.
Little bit different now, yeah. Yeah.
But we heard Coach Kelly speak the other day, and he reminded us, even forget the NIL, as part of your scholarship, correct me if I'm wrong, a player gets about $35,000 a year. And that surprised most of us, because a lot of guys came to LSU with so, you know, and they had to interact with all the other college students. So I think puts it in a different context, is they're not flat broke.
Right, and that came from the education benefits partially, right, which was the Austin case. That's where that happened. Okay, yes?
Do you see, or are you gonna see in the next several years, universities located in cities with high concentration of corporate headquarters benefiting those universities, and say Louisiana, for instance, has a lack of corporations?
Repeat the question.
Being on the town side.
So the question was, and again, I didn't repeat the second to last one again, was will we see universities in bigger markets ultimately, right, with more corporations, will they benefit from the fact that they're able to do bigger deals with bigger corporations? Go ahead.
The best way to answer that. It's a good question. I like that question. I have to think about that question. You know, that was already kind of combated with collectives because we couldn't compete with Nike in Oregon, right? So they stepped up for Oregon pretty quickly. I do think that some of these larger markets will see the money that comes in with sports, right? Northwestern's probably a good example, actually, of that, where the focus is on education there, but why not have both? I do think that will happen.
I think, to add on to that, I think you can look at it both ways. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The USCs of the world, UCLAs of the world, right? Okay. But there's something to be said about the smaller market where basically the university is the lifeblood of the market, where people are more prone, or a higher percentage of the community is more prone to donate. So I think it could equal out because we live in a college town, right? Tuscaloosa is a college town. So I think you can look at it both ways. Yes?
And you still, you still want to go, you know, history repeats itself, right? You want to go where you can win, you want to go where the coaches are, and you want to go where they have the best facilities. So that still has a play in all of this.
So my alumni, I graduated from Texas Tech, their alumni association put together a collective that every student, every player got 25 grand.
Right.
This last year. I think they're trying to grow that. They're doing it through the alumni. Is that a directive that you're kind of working on, or is that another aspect of it?
You repeat the question, you're better at that.
So ultimately, he's asking, he went to Texas Tech, where, and
Guns
it was, yeah, her father played at Texas Tech, legend, Billy Joe Tolliver. They set up,
One of the best quarterbacks outside of Ole.
there
Thank you, thank you.
They set it up to where each football player was going to make $25,000.
Yeah.
And that did happen. Okay, so go ahead.
Are you talking about the Matador Club?
Well, yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if they had a new one, so I'm familiar with the Matador Club. And is that something that we are looking to do? Is that what, or locally, that we're looking to
You're
do?
talking collective. I don't think that Tech has what you're talking about, a collective outside of that's happening. Or they may, I'm not.
Well, so, okay, Matador Club, they were one of the first, actually, to form a collective, so they got 501c3 status, which changes things a bit. A lot of other collectives aren't able to get that status anymore. So it's hard for us to compete with that unless everything were to fall under TAF, but that's a whole nother, we can get into that too if we need to, yeah.
So we only have time for one more question because I know y'all got a hard stop
Oh,
at
sorry.
1, so go ahead.
All right, do you see any opportunities for nonprofit organizations to work with NIL deals and be a part of that, and community service in particular?
So he's asking if we see any ability for non-profit organizations to be involved in the space ultimately and work with athletes in the community. Yes, it's been done since the beginning. The problem is, and I think where if the federal legislation gets involved, okay, it's going to be the first thing dug into. Because I think we all agree in here that not every charity deal done in NIL is true charity, right? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, those are going to be dug into. There are universities, Northwestern is one, okay, that we know for a fact is doing it like you're supposed to do it. They have a ton of deliverables for these kids to do to make the money that they're going to make, and what they do per deliverable is not outlandish, right? And so, yes, there are opportunities as long as you do it the right way, but again, I'm just not sure how long it's going to be valid. so to
Yeah,
speak.
I think if you are a for-profit collective and the deliverable is tied to a charity, that's where we've seen the most success because the auditing really doesn't matter for marketing purposes, right? But if you are a charity, either paying an athlete or the 501c3 status that I was talking about, that's why Matador Club, for example, stops at $25,000. Who am I to pay a 5-star high school athlete $100,000 to represent this charity with 4 deliverables, but I only pay a gymnast with 1 million followers $10,000 to represent the charity? That's where you come into trouble, and I think that's why it has to stay under a for-profit, but we'll still see the charity work.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.